Traffic Steps topic for February 2021 is the God image, Pathwork Lecture 52. It follows the work we did in January on the call, which is Pathwork Lecture 17. It's a dilemma sometimes what sequence to bring lectures forward in. The premise is that this is a spiritual philosophy, practice, and path, that the lecture on the call is about a spiritual calling, and that when you're looking at a spiritual calling, a natural concern would be if there's any hostility about spirit, you would not want to answer the call. But that's always true with these lectures. You need one to understand the other, and backwards and forwards. So sometimes I just follow a certain sequence based on intuition and instinct, which is a form of calling. And I have to trust it. It's all I've got to take my best estimate evaluation about what people are interested in and what sequence might be of service to them. So I'm following up on the call with the God image to explore the image, the impression, the sense of what spiritual reality is for you. God is shorthand. It's also a less developed, more primitive projection of what an eternal creative being would be based upon a less mature level of development in society. In other words, we take the idea of man and we presume a more perfect man, mankind, and that becomes our image of God. A good example is the Greek and Roman myths. They imagine almighty beings. However, those beings are in the images of the creatures who create them. Although the phrase is that God created man in his own image, there's a presumption there that we know who God was in the first place to say that God created man. It is more accurate to presume that man created God in man's own image, simply because that's what we know. We know human experience, we know the human perspective and viewpoint, we know human concerns and needs, and so when we imagine a more perfect being, it would naturally be a more perfect being of ourselves. And along with that goes the idea of an idealized version of ourselves. Now, with Greek and Roman myths, you get gods who are jealous, gods who are mean and nasty, sneaky, who lie and cheat, because they are really projections of human beings. And it's the invention of such gods is as much of an exploration of what human beings are as they are giving over authority to those gods. So in other words, the invention of them may be a mass psychosis, mass way of trying to understand human nature by focusing on the equivalent of celebrities. So back then, when you didn't have television, you had gods, and we all knew what those gods were, what they represented. We liked this god, we didn't like that god. It's not dissimilar to today, where we express the values and beliefs that we have based on who we admire, who we read about, who we talk about. So if we come back to the God image, this lecture is about this projection we have that we call God. So as I warn people in the study guide, if the word God concerns you in any way, if you have any reaction to it, if it is too associative with religion or other belief systems or what you've been taught, let the word God go and substitute the word of your choice. In 12-step group, it's higher power. You can substitute the idea of a creative intelligence permeating the universe. But I invite you to move past the words themselves. All words are shorthand for a concept or an idea. And the word God itself calls forward an image. So you're going to have to manage that to look at the image itself. I break these down into 4 sections because I do normally 4 meetings per month. The first was that images of authority become images of God, then the reality of God versus images of God, how to dissolve an image, because images is a large portion of this lecture, and the reality of God versus human projection. So you can see that perhaps more than other lectures, God keeps coming up in this lecture. And so the first thing you'll need to deal with is your reaction, response, attraction to, I'm trying to think of the other word for attraction, repulsion from the word God itself. And there's a very wonderful teacher in Pathwork, Carolyn Tylove, who gave a presentation one time. And she was called How to Read a Lecture. And she said, you have to stop reading when you have a reaction. You really need to honor whatever your reaction is whenever it comes up. Now, it can be after the entire lecture on the last page, could be in the middle, could be on the first page. And then she gave the most delightful example. She said, I have occasionally had trouble reading the very starting words, dearest, greetings, my dearest friends. And at that time, I was still a student, and I had this huge sigh of relief because occasionally I reacted against that kind of greeting. It felt very personal. It felt like I had to say yes to something that I sometimes was not in the mood to say yes to. And I took her words in and used them. And if I react to greetings, my dearest friends, that's what my work was in that moment. So in a long way around, that's what I'm inviting you to do. If you read the title, The God Image, and you react to that, that's your work. Stop there. Now, the rest of the lecture can help you, but don't try to push past that. Allow that reaction and work with that reaction. So if I go through the 4 subtopics, the first is that images of authority become images of God. This is about how it's the psyche of the human being. It's how we develop as animals, as human beings. It's how our intellect develops that. Our childhood experiences are projected onto the next batch of experiences. If I have a certain series of experiences as a child, the next time I encounter a similar experience, I will take my history and bring my conclusions forward and apply them to the new situation. Now, in theory, as I apply them, I find that there's more to be learned. There's some differences, and I incorporate that. I enlarge my experience, my concept. And with each successive experience, I enlarge my concept even more. Sometimes our concepts get stuck. So here's how the child's logic goes in learning to deal with God. Because God can't actually be experienced. It's an interpretation, a subjective interpretation. So a lot of what God is about is stuff we hear, stuff we're taught, rather than a personal experience. So the child's logic is that God is presented as the highest authority. So authority is what God is best at. And my experience as a child with authority becomes what my experience of God will be. Understand that as a child, I would not be able to process a direct epiphany, a direct spiritual experience with God, that it would be hard for a child to grasp what's going on. I'm not saying children don't have direct experiences of God, but they may not be able to contain it and think of it like that. They may think of it as something else. So that if I have problems with the authority figures in my family, parents, caretakers, older siblings, my experience of how they wield authority becomes magnified when I think of God as the ultimate authority. Now, the guide talks about 2 different kinds of experiences of authority. One is of a benign authority, God will give me everything I want. The problem with benign authority, or basically spoiling a child and saying everything will be provided to you, is that at some point in most people's lives, that will stop happening. So in other words, if I teach you, you can have anything you want every minute you want, and there will be no pain or discomfort of any kind in your life, it is probably impossible for me to prevent life from intruding, reality from intruding at some point. And the longer that goes on, the more brutal the interaction with a different reality is going to be. So there's one path where you think authority is just as great, but life will bring you other experiences later on. The one we focus on more of is when authority is perceived as hostile. So if injustices are perpetrated by people who stand as authority figures, we unconsciously associate them as we grow with what God would be. Our unconscious belief in God's severe justice is strengthened. So that if mom finds out that I lie and she punishes me, what would God do? If God found out that I lied, God would punish me. It's a direct extension of the same logic. So this forms an image that makes, if properly analyzed, a monster out of God. Meaning, if we take a human being and we make them all powerful and all knowing, we are taking an imperfect being with agendas, blind spots, prejudices, and perhaps a little greed or avarice, a little pride, self-will, and fear, and we're making them huge. It's going to magnify their wonderful qualities. It's also going to magnify their negative qualities. And in comic books, in film, in stories, you've heard the idea of a toddler, giant toddler running the planet. You don't know what it's going to do. You can't communicate. It does what it wants to do without regard for you. There's a wonderful Twilight Zone episode of a story, black and white, old television story of a child played by Billy Mumy, child actor, where the child has omnipotent powers and he holds his entire family hostage. They can't afford to cross him because he will enforce his way, and his way is limited by his immature thinking process, his undeveloped self. To some extent, this is what we perceive as God, the equivalent of an undeveloped human being. It is difficult to think of what a human being would be like if they were fully developed and had no negativity. Very few of us experience human beings like that. If we experience a human being like that, we probably don't know them very well. So it is common for, in biographies, you will read about wonderful, great people who do wonderful things, and there were problems in their family lives. Because a human being is a mixed bag. So when we see somebody from afar, it's easy to only see their good qualities. We're not present day to day, 24/7 with who they are in all different given circumstances. And this is the kind of thing that allows us to project an image. I believe this person is perfect is not a realistic evaluation of that human being. So we take our experience with authority, we project it onto God, and it becomes an image. In week 2, we looked at the reality of God versus images of God. And the guide suggests several different ways of looking at, let me say, the word God. One is that God is the life force, that God is the actual moving energy, moving consciousness, moving because consciousness is always alive, that God is the consciousness that permeates the universe. Now, this would explain why some people can say we are God, or that we are in God or of God. I have encountered people who feel that is blasphemous. I can understand that there's a reluctance to elevate human beings to the stature of God. I'm explaining a different way of understanding that we contain part of the divine energy. We may contain it and exercise it inappropriately, but that's our exercising of it rather than an innate negativity or flaw in the divine energy itself. And that's what Pathwork teaches. So another way the guide describes this is think of this life force as you think of an electric current endowed with supreme intelligence. So it's not just an energy, a life flow, a current, it's a current with intelligence. This electric current is there in you, around you, outside of yourself. It's up to you how you use it. You can use electricity for constructive purposes, even for healing, or you can use it to kill. This does not make the electric current good or bad. You make it good or bad. And I want to argue a little bit with that phrase. You make it good or bad. You utilize it for constructive or destructive purposes. One of the premises in Pathwork is that we are given the power to be destructive, to learn not to do that. Now, that seems contrary to an ideal of what people are supposed to be. People are supposed to be good. And yet, like children, it is important for us to make messes, see it's a mess, and learn to clean it up. And the premise in Pathwork is that the human experience is about manifesting both the positive and negative aspects of ourselves, to enjoy the positive, have a good time, make it as big as possible, and to see, notice, and do something about the negative current. Now, we don't bring negative current here thinking that negative is positive, but we may come here with a confusion in our belief system that makes us believe that something is positive when it actually contains negativity. The guide's description of this is that we are holding a false belief, something that simply isn't true, or a distortion, which is it's true but not in the way we understand it, or a misconception where we've missed the mark. We hear a concept, but we express it incorrectly, and we're holding that misconception, which is different from a false belief. These are subtleties, but I like the combination of these words, false belief, misconception, or distortion, that we bring those in with the intention to find the truth in them and to heal them and to release them. So in this way, the negative energy on the planet Earth is not a defect in the process, it's the purpose of the process. Now, people point and say, yes, but that's too much negativity, or that person doesn't understand. And this is dealt with in other lectures and other concepts. But basically, the negativity that you experience personally is about what you need to learn. Other people are experiencing different forms of negativity. Sometimes we interlock or interact with that, and sometimes we simply observe it. To observe someone else's process and to fear that it will spread, that it is contagious, has a grain of truth in it. Negativity is contagious, meaning I can come to believe what you believe. It can also be an example of how somebody else gets it wrong, and we can use that example to see where we get something wrong. Went off into a sidebar just then. So basically, coming back to the reality of God versus the images of God, therefore it is not God who is unjust, as your subconscious may believe, but it is your wrong use of the powerful current at your disposal. One of the lectures that deals with this is Pathwork Lecture 18 on free will. Philosophically, there are mountains of information on the use of free will, what it's about. So I'm going to let that go. In week 3, we looked at how to dissolve an image. And the guide very often will go through a 1, 2, 3, 4 sequence. It's not meant to be a solution to your God image. It's meant as a suggested way of exploring the topic. So the first suggestion is that you become conscious of the wrong concept to the full extent. Now, I deal with that as a two-part aspect. Become conscious of the wrong concept. And then to the full extent means you may become conscious of the wrong concept, do some work, come back and see a deeper extent and do work on that, and come back and see another layer of the work and do that. That it's a constant, call it rinse, wash, repeat, or wash, rinse, repeat. Instead of saying, this is what you do and you will be done. So it's a process of going through and cleansing and examining and cleansing. So you become conscious of the wrong concept. You set straight your intellectual ideas. Sometimes when we think of things intellectually, it sounds like a good idea. It doesn't work in practice. And this is an important step. So intellectually, I have to be very careful about examples that I use, especially when they're being filmed, because if I come up with a bad one, it lasts as long as the video is up. But for instance, people who are not parents and haven't dealt with small children very often have intellectual ideas about what children are, how to deal with them, how to parent. And then there's the reality that parents and caregivers know. That means you have to bend those intellectual ideas. You have to, it's like the difference between brand new clothes with sizing or starch in them versus well-worn clothes. You need to flesh those ideas out. You need to put some practical reality in, and you need to realize the false beliefs, misconceptions, and distortions in an intellectual idea versus the day-to-day reality. You basically wear it in so that it works in real life. Intellectual ideas versus the reality of experience. It needs to be met. So set straight your intellectual ideas, match them to your emotional reality. Thirdly, to find a common denominator in all your conflicts. Concept in Pathwork is that there's a pattern of repetition in something that's an image that you need to deal with. Let me put this differently. If it's significant in your life, if you are dealing with a false belief, misconception, or distortion, it's going to happen more than once, because it would happen in any aspect of life that you tried to express your life force in, because you would be going forward with a false idea. If you take science as an example, if you have a misconception about gravitational force, every experiment or everything you do that relies on the truth of gravitational force will be affected by your misunderstanding of that force or power. Same thing in spiritual work. Any false belief, misconception, or distortion that you are holding will manifest as a distortion in your life force. And that will create patterns, repetitions throughout your life. And these patterns and repetitious events are gold. They allow you to collect examples of similar incidents and look at them and be able to see a range of activities and thought processes and find the common denominator. And when you find the common denominator, the common false belief, misconception, or distortion that energizes these painful events or disharmonious circumstances, and you deal with that and you find what is the truth of that, and you are able to dissolve it, which is part of dissolving an image, then you get relief over a variety of interactions in your life. It's very cost effective for the amount of time you put into, rather than finding one problem and fixing one problem, and then another problem and fixing another problem. The current expression, playing whack-a-mole, is an example. The idea is to find out what is the mechanism in this, and to address the mechanism of these disharmonious events, rather than constantly go from one event to the next. So to find the common denominator in the patterns. And the pattern, a pattern of events, indicates there's an image involved. Then to become aware of what is false about it. That's hard work. Once again, you may find that you need to do this in layers. To find some false aspect, test it out, explore it. Find another false aspect, test it, explore it. Then you think you're done. And then you notice another layer of repetition of events of disharmony. And you go back through the process again to find out what is false about it. The guide advises, do not superimpose your will over your emotional reality. This is common in human beings, that we deny emotional reality, we superimpose our will, our intellectual ideas, and say that the emotional reality is trivial or unimportant. Emotional reality is dealt with in Pathwork as an equal partner. Just like intellectual ideas can be incorrect, emotional ideas, emotional realities, emotional perceptions can be incorrectly diagnosed. They are real, we feel sad, we feel angry. It's the why we feel angry. It's the blame and the justification that is incorrectly assigned or deduced. The feeling itself needs to be honored. So the work in Pathwork is to clean up our perception of our feelings, to divorce them from the justification and the blame, to hold them just as they are, and then notice the similarity in another instance and the similarity in another instance, instead of trying to solve the emotional problem by superimposing intellectual ideas, or we won't feel that because it's unpleasant. So do not superimpose your will over your emotional reality. We want to honor it, not obey it, just honor it. And lastly, to monitor where you deviate emotionally from what you believe intellectually is right. One of the tools that I use in my Pathwork and in my teaching is to notice discrepancies. So in other words, I feel this way, but I act that way. The idea is to bring them into alignment. My feelings feed my intellect feeds my feelings, so that we're going in the same direction instead of making it an either or. Another aspect within this lecture is the topic of spiritual injustice. Now that goes back to the other ideas of God being the greatest authority. Since human authority is imperfect, human justice is imperfect. And we project that possibility in the spirit. There's a phrase at some point in this lecture or another, I lose track sometimes of where I read things, where the guide says, a miracle is just something where you don't understand the mechanism. A miracle, just, you've got the answer, but you don't know how you got there. You've got the result, but you don't see the process. In human history, one of the reasons I love science and I love the details of politics, the details of power struggles, the details of human anthropology and archaeology and all these things, is that anything can seem like a miracle if you don't understand the mechanism that got us there. And if you want to work with the result, it is important to understand the dynamics behind it. And the example I use is in the medieval times when they thought that they were working with the concept. Remember that human beings try to create a concept that works here and everywhere. And there was a concept called spontaneous life. They thought that life just happened. And one of the examples that they had of life just happening is that maggots would appear in dead meat. And somebody made the simplest of experiments. They put meat in 2 jars. They put gauze over the opening of one jar and left the other jar open, and lo and behold, maggots appeared in the jar that was left open and did not appear in the jar with the gauze on top. The logical explanation was that we hadn't seen the mechanism of the flies landing and laying eggs and then leaving, momentary. But when that was prevented, the so-called spontaneous life did not erupt. Pathwork has made my life so much better because it helps me to understand the dynamics going on in my life. And that is my invitation to you, is that disharmonious activities are not random. And on this topic, there is no spiritual injustice, but there can be justice that where we've lost track of the effect and we're only seeing the result. Now, that's very hard to teach to human beings because the cause and effect could be extensive. It could be 10 years away. But think of it this way. There's a common acceptance nowadays of karma. So 20 years ago, someone robbed the bank and they felt justified doing it, and then they changed their life and they got straight. And then 20 years later, somebody knocks at the door and arrests them. But in that 20 years, they have paid their taxes, they've raised children, they've become model citizens. It can feel unjust to be dragged back and made to pay for a mistake in your youth when you have actually rehabilitated yourself and become what society would like you to be. And yet, there is justice in that. There's a place where we never fully gave restitution. We never dealt with that one violation of taking what we wanted against the law. And there needs to be a reckoning of that. But 20 years later, it can feel like an injustice to be forced to do that. The more subtle example is where we don't fully see, we don't fully realize where we broke a law, and then we're having to do restitution for it. We're having to come to a reckoning with something that we didn't recognize in the first place. So it is difficult to deal generically with the concept of spiritual injustice. It must be dealt with on an individualized basis, and it's up to us whether we choose to accept or not accept the concept in our lives and how it's applied. But it's part of this lecture, and it's a really interesting topic. There's also a lecture on injustice, Pathwork lecture 248, which would add to this. In week 4, we looked at the reality of God versus human projections, which is similar to the beginning. And basically what this says is whatever your image is in the respect of the God image is where you begin. And this adds in not to superimpose an intellectual idea. I should not feel this way. Does not change how you feel. So the reality of God versus your human projection, you need to get honest about how you feel about God, how you feel about authority, how you feel about spirit, spiritual law, injustice, etc. That's your starting point. If there's a discrepancy between what you want to believe versus what you feel, it is the discrepancy, that area of the discrepancy, where I invite you to work. I invite you to explore. And for instance, if you're convinced of injustice, the remedy is that you find in your own life how you have caused happenings that seem entirely unjust, to find the cause and effect of your own inner and outer deeds. Now, that process requires a phrase that isn't in the lectures, but it sure sounds like it should be in the lectures, and that is scrupulous honesty. And there's something in the words, there's something onomatopoetic in the word scrupulous that I love because it sounds like scrubbing. And it is a sense of being scrubbed harshly. For us to admit where we were wrong or unfair, where we deserve what we got, requires a level of honesty that can feel brutal. And it's hard work. And so any idea that if I'm honest, I will be condemned is going to make it double impossible. Number one, I have to be honest. And secondly, I invite condemnation. part of studying the God image. It isn't in this lecture per se, it's in other lectures, but part of what Pathwork teaches is a benign universe. God is not out to punish us. Now, there are a lot of religions and philosophies on the planet where that's taught. God is there as the ultimate authority to punish you when you're wrong so you can learn the better way. That is not what Pathwork teaches. Pathwork presents the idea that God sent us here to learn. He knows what we're trying to learn. He knows our failings, our limitations, our negativities. But that there is also the positive intent in us. And like the perfect parent, there's an invitation from the world of spirit for us to be the very best we can be, and a willingness to forgive, meaning a willingness to allow us to work out our negativities, not escape the effects of them, but to work out our negativities, which means we manifest negativity and we encounter disharmony and cause and effect in the real world. And then at any given moment, we decide, do we want to continue down a destructive negative path, or do we want to change over to a more loving, more inclusive, more generous, etc. way of living? These are our choices. But I invite you to see this different form of projection image as the concept of spiritual universe, where the imitation is for us to be the best we can, and that our limitations are noted and acknowledged, and real world feedback will take care of a lot of it. That there's a sense of God's grace is different in Pathwork than in many philosophies that you may have encountered. And this is why we need to be honest about any of the experiences that we have had with human religions, and to see where they were meant for our good, but they may have been a little heavy-handed. So the study of Pathwork is to encourage the positive, acknowledge the negative. So thanks for listening to this. This has been a summary of Pathwork Lecture 52, The God Image. I hope you actually read the lecture. That's my goal in presenting this material, to add some commentary to words that I couldn't possibly improve by themselves. Thanks for listening.